Hi everybody, Yaya here, and today I'm gonna show you one of my favorite plugins for After Effects, Plexus 3. This is a really powerful tool, and I'm gonna show you how I used it to build this shot. So I'm gonna show you how Plexus works, and hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you will be able to get creative with Plexus 3, and really the sky is the limit. So we are here inside After Effects, and let's have a look at what's going on here in this shot that we're going to recreate together. Now, as you can see in this shot, we have a few objects, and each one of them is actually created inside Plexus, and each one of them is connected with lines. Now, the way that we decide where each of these objects is going to be is by assigning each one of them to a light object. Now, let's jump into this clean composition. And actually, we have one layer here, which is this color scheme that I made. It's hidden right now with the shy button. I just wanted it to be out of our way. So I'm gonna hide this. Now, I'm going to create a new solid, and I want to name this Plexus Lights, Points, Lines. Now, the reason I name this way is because Plexus is going to look at our lights and generate points and lines. So what we need to do now is go to the effects and find Plexus and add that to our solid. And right away you can see we have this Plexus object panel where we can add geometry, add effector, add render, and so on. And here in the effect controls we have Plexus point renderer and the general Plexus settings. This happens every time you assign Plexus to a solid layer. Now, we can't see anything at the moment, even though we have points renderer, and that is because Plexus must have some kind of geometry to look at. So what I'm going to do is click on the layer, go to Add Geometry, and Add Layers. Now inside this layer, it says Object Type Lights. It means that this object is looking for lights, and we don't have any lights. So let's create one. I'm going to create a new light, and I'm going to use this light one with this first color here, and click OK. And now we can see we have this little dot here. You can barely see it. Let me just go and get the point size up so you can see. So basically what happened is that Plexus is looking at lights and rendering points. Let me set the point size to 20. And the next thing I want to do is to create another light. So right click, new light, light number 2 with color number 2. And we can't really see this light, and if I go to the position values and I just move it a little bit to the left, and you see that wherever this light is moving to, the point would move with. So basically Plexus is using the position of the light and the color of the light to generate points in 3D space. Now let's add 2 more lights to our composition. Light number 3 with color number 3. I'm just going to reposition it a little bit. Now new light, light number 4 with color number 4. And I'm going to reposition this light as well so we can see all of them clearly. Next, I just want to play around a little bit with the position of my lights. And I can go here on the view and choose 4 views. And here we have the top, front, active camera, and right. and I can see more clearly where each of my lights are. So point light number 4, if I move the z-axis, if you look at the top view, you can see how my lights is going deeper in the z-axis. I'm just going to place that there. Light number 3 here. Light number 1 would go somewhere over here. And light number 2 right there. Yeah, I'm happy with this. Now, going on my front view, I can adjust the X and Y axis and get a clear idea of how things are gonna look like. So I'm gonna just spread them around this way, going back to one view and see the result. Now, let's create a new camera and click OK, just so we can have a look around and see what we have. So if I just use the camera tool to toggle around here, I can zoom in, I can zoom out, and we can see how Plexus had generated points in 3D space. And this is our first step toward this shot. And as you can see, each one of these objects is a light that Plexus is looking at and generating a point. Right, back to our composition. Our next step is going to be creating lines between our points. So clicking on the Plexus layer, right now Plexus is looking at our lights, generating points, and we want to add a renderer, lines. So at the moment we can't see anything, and that's because there's a maximum distance of 100 points. And right here between our points there's more than 100 points. So let's crank that up until we see something. And right now you see how the lines are starting to be generated between our points. Now let's get a closer look. We can see our points connected with lines, all in 3D space. Now let's have a look at what we're going to do next. Here in our reference we have these objects, and we're going to create them using Plexus. So let's create a new composition, but this time I'm not going to name this because I just want to have a clean composition to work in and generate new Plexus layers, and then I'm just going to copy them and paste them in our main composition. Moving on, we're going to create a new solid, and let's name this one Plexus Object Number 1. And the reason for this is because object number 1 would be assigned to light number 1. Object number 2 would be assigned to light number 2, and so on. Now this time, I already have the Plexus object panel open. So instead of going to the effects and finding Plexus, I can just click Add Plexus, and I'm going to get everything like before. I'm going to have the Plexus points renderer and the Plexus settings. Here I have the add geometry and effectors like before. So I want to add geometry, and this time I want to use the paths. And the paths are looking at all the masks I have on my Plexus layer and generating points on each one of these masks. So if I go and use my polygon tool to create a new mask, and now I have this nice hexagon in the middle of my screen. And to see really what's going on there, I'm going to create a new camera. Click OK. And now I want to zoom in a little bit. And you see we have all the points generated along this mask. And when I use the camera tool to move around, you see how the points are actually in 3D space. Now, if you really want to, you can even go to the mask path and add keyframes and animate this mask along the timeline. Now, this already gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of power to animate inside Plexus, but I'm not going to go into masks animation. So I'm going to delete what I did and go back to our path object. Now, if we go here to the replication menu and toggle down, we reveal a lot of cool options for us to play with. Now, look here, the total number of copies is 1. So this is what we see, 1 copy. If I click 2, we generate 2 copies, and 3 copies, 4, and so on. And the distance between the first and the last is the extrude depth. Now I can cramp that up or down. Going back to my camera tool, I'll just set the view like this, and now we can just fly through this time tunnel and go back in time and change your past or whatever. But for now, let's just reset the camera, and I'm gonna set the view back to something that we can actually see what we're dealing with. So I want 2 copies and the extrude depth 20 points, and let's get closer. See, this is pretty much what we were aiming at from our reference. We have 2 shapes, 2 copies of this hexagon shape. Now, I don't really want to use the points, so I'm going to hide this point renderer, and I'm going to add lines renderer. Now, let's get a closer look at these lines, and I'll put it back to full resolution to really see what's going on. I can take the line thickness down to 0.1. Now I want to have a few more lines viewing, so I need to take up the max number of vertices, and I'll put it up to 20, and actually the line thickness be 0.2, and I'm pretty happy with how things look like. We're getting closer. Looking back at the reference again, we're going to add this text layer. So back to my composition, I'm going to add new text layer, and I'm going to type in IP, and let's just set the properties here. Open sans, bold, and I want to have only the strokes, so I'm gonna flip the stroke and the fill. I can take the stroke to about 3.3, looking nice. Now I would like to make sure it's centered in view, so right click on the layer, go to transform, click center in view. Great. Now the next thing we want to do is make it a 3D layer. As you can see, it's not reacting to our camera. So just go and click this 3D box, and there you go. The only thing that is a little big, so in the scale I can take it down to about 67, looking good. And we are now ready to copy our IP and object 1, Command C, and paste it in our main composition, Command V, over point light number 1. And there we go. One more thing I want to do is select the text layer and use the stroke eyedrop on color number 1. So we have the same color. And now I'm going to do the same inside our Plexus object. We're going to the Plexus path object, and in the color we have the eyedropper, and the same on color number 1. So now when we move around with the camera, we see that our object number 1 is inside the same space with our lights. And now we're facing one of the biggest challenges that I had in this project, which is assigning the position of object number 1 to light number 1. In other words, wherever light number 1 goes, object number 1 goes with. Now, just to keep things tidy in our timeline, let's select these three and assign them with the color yellow. Now, light number one, object number one, and IP all the same yellow color. Now, click P to see the position. And at first you may think, yeah, let's just parent object number one to light number one, and that's it. Unfortunately, this is not how this works, and we actually have to go to our Plexus layer and make adjustments inside. Right now, this object is in the middle of the composition, and the way that we can manipulate and transform the position of this object would be inside the effector, transform. And here we can rotate on the x-axis, we can rotate the y-axis and the z-axis. You can set keyframes, you can add expressions, and have a lot of cool animations with this only. But we want to look at the translate. So when I move the translate, you see it actually changes our position in 3D space. Now, what we're going to do is create expressions by holding Alt and clicking the stopwatch for the X, Y, and Z. And what that does is creating expressions in our timeline. Now, if I click EE, it'll show me the expressions only for the X, Y, and Z. And next, all I have to do is to assign each one of them to the position of light number one. So X to X, Y to Y, and Z to Z, and voila, it didn't work. Let me zoom out so we can see where it is now, all over the way in the corner. I actually don't know why Plexus is behaving this way, and even if I go here and play around with these values, you see nothing is really happening. So I had to come up with a different solution, and I came up with a way to work around it. So what you need to do is to go down here, and we're going to adjust our expression. We're going to add a few things. So we need to type minus, open bracket, this comp dot width divided by 2, close brackets. And you can already see the X position of our object had changed. Now I'm going to just copy the end of my expression and paste it on this Y expression. The only thing left to do is to change the width to height. And now when I click enter, yes, our object is now positioned perfectly on top of our light. So in the expression, we told it to be half of the height, half of the width of the composition, and it solved our problem. So right now, it's placed perfectly on top of our light number one, and no matter if we move the camera around, it all sits nicely. Even when I play around with the position of the light, the object is following its every move. So this is how I did it on this project. I would love to know of a better way of going around and doing it, but this is what I know so far. I'll just reset the camera now, and the next thing we want to do is take the text layer, this IP, and assign it to the same light number one. So in the position, Alt click, and we get the expression, so we can pick whip the position to the position of light number one, and there you go. You see that the color of the IP had changed a little bit, and that's because reacting to the light. So you can open up the material options and click off on accept lights. And now it's back to its original color. Great, now the next thing we're going to do is to create more objects. Right now we have object 1. I want to have object number 2, 3, and 4 assigned to these lights. And the best way I found to do it is to use the one I've already created and just duplicate, Command D. And I'm going to call this object 2. Drag it over our light number 2, just so everything would be nice, tidy. I'm going to give this green color. And let's have a look at what we have here. Basically, we have this shape created by this mask. I'm going to change this shape by using a really cool integration between Adobe Illustrator and After Effects. Now I'll go here into Illustrator, and you see I have this composition which is the same size as my composition in After Effects. Now all the shapes that I'm going to create here in Adobe Illustrator are going to be positioned exactly the same way when I paste it into After Effects. So I'm going to select this path, Command C, switch over to After Effects, go into the mask, and select the mask and Command V. And that's it. If I get a little closer, you can see that these are the same shapes I created in Illustrator, and I can just take it from Illustrator, drop it in After Effects, and Plexus is going to look at those shapes and create the lines. Now I need to assign it to the right light. Right now, if I click EE, and I see in the expression it says light 1. So I'm just going to change the number to 2. I'm going to do the same on the y-axis, light number 2, and on the last one, light number 2. And that's it. Now my object number 2 is assigned to the position of light number 2. And if we have a look, now we have 2 different objects assigned to 2 different lights. So one more thing we can do is go to object number 2 and change the color to color number 2. Great, now let's just reset the camera, and I'm going to repeat this process to object number 3 and 4. So I'm going to do that real quick and we can move on. So duplicate, change the expressions to light number 3. Choose different shapes, replace the masks, duplicate, change to light number 4, choose different shapes, replace the masks, and now assign the right colors, and there we go. Great, so things are looking good. All of my objects are pinned to their lights, and I can just reset the camera and we can move on to the next step. So right now we have these points on top of our objects that are being generated by our Plexus lights, points, and lines. And we can just uncheck this box and get rid of them. So this already looks much nicer, but still, where the lines are connected, it's still a little bit distracting and I want to get rid of it. So one way of doing it is creating another layer with points to cover that up and make it look as if they are not being connected. So we're going to our Plexus lights, points, and lines, and we're just going to duplicate this layer. And in this layer, I'm going to put back my points renderer. I can get rid of my line renderer, and we are going to use some sort of a shade texture and make it look as if it's being fade out. Okay, let's delete these lines renderer, and before we getting confused, we're going to name this Plexus Points Shader. So I'm going to my project panel, and I'm going to show you this comp I created called Shade Pre. I'm going to drop it in here. Double click this to show you what it is. It's a feathered circle and it's going to act as our shader. So back to our composition, I'm going to uncheck this because we don't need to see it. And in my Plexus points shader, I'm going to go back to my effects control and Plexus points renderer. And here you see in the textured sprite, I'm going to select shade pre. So now Plexus is looking at our lights and rendering the points with the texture that we assigned. Now if I crank that up more, you start to see how the lines are being fade out where they meet, and that's only because we put a shade on it. And I can play around with this value, get it bigger, smaller. I can really dial it up a lot. I'm just gonna type in 100. Now let's have a look with the camera. Things are looking good. Great, so we're almost there. I'm just going to reset the camera and we can move on to our next step. Going back, looking at our reference shot, we can see that there's a lot going on in the background. You can see there's a lot of lines and dots connected. And I find it more interesting and more organic to have things going on in the background rather than just a black background. And the objective of this scene is to show the cyber world where there's a lot of numbers and data and codes, everything connected. And this is going to be pretty easy to create. So if we jump in here to our comp number 1, I'm going to create a new solid and call it Plexus Cybernet. Hit OK and go here, add Plexus, and this time we're not going to use layers, not paths, but primitives. And now we get this beautiful cube made out of points in our composition. Now create a new camera so I can move around, and this cube is just beautiful. Let's look around. It's made out of all these points. Here in the primitive type inside Plexus, we can toggle between cube or sphere, and both options are really cool. There's a lot of things you can do with this. You can have the sphere radius, you can add slices, and this is really beautiful. It's really powerful. I like just looking at it. It just looks great. So going back to the cube, let's set back our view. Going to reset the camera. And now I want to spread the points around, get a random noise on their position. And the way to do that is to go up here, add effector, choose noise. And here in the noise effector, we see that it apply noise to vertices. Now in the noise amplitude, you crank that up and you can see how the points starting to spread around like stars in the sky in a random manner and fill up the screen. Now let me just go in here and type 4000 and I'm happy with this. The next thing we want to do is to connect these dots with lines. So go to the add renderer and click lines. Now we get lines already, and if we want to have some more, we need to crank up the maximum distance. And you see we get more and more lines, and this looks really complex already. And I think this is just beautiful, and this is a really signature look for Plexus. Now I'm going to dial this down a little bit because I don't need so many. I need just a few, so I can take the vertices down to 3, and so only some of the points are going to be connected. And if I move the camera around, you can see how we are inside this 3D space and things are looking pretty nice. Now I want to add even more randomness, so I can go and add another noise, and we can click here in the menu, noise factor 2, and change it to scale. Now if I scale the amplitude of this noise, see how some of the points are getting larger and some of the points are getting smaller. so we have noise on our scale. Now let's do this one more time. Add effector noise, and this time choose color. And if we go here to our primitive object and change the color to something more bluish, something around here, okay, and back to our effector 3, which is the color RGB. Now, if I take this value up a lot, you can just see really strong colors of the rainbow. But if we keep it down around 100, I think this gives us a gentle randomness, and this is exactly what we want for our background. And now, copy paste it in our main composition, like we did before. And we might need to adjust it just a little bit to fit around our objects. So I want to move it to really surround our objects. So the way to do this is use our Cybernet, and in the effector, let's click on transform, and like before, let's look in our menu, Plexus transform. And we just want to adjust this cloud of Cybernet a little bit. So let's first reset our camera and then go to the 4 views, and there we can see everything at once. Now I'm just gonna play around a little bit with the translate and make sure it sits nicely on our objects. So move this a little bit to the left, and I think that looks fine. Going back to view 1 and reset the camera, and that's it. We have our Cybernet background ready. Now the next thing we're going to use is the depth of field. This is a really powerful option we have inside Plexus, and it gives us the ability to use the camera settings to create depth of field. So let's use object number 1 as an example and see how this works. Now in the Plexus settings, there's something called unified rendering. Check this box and you'll get a lot more options. And here, the first one would be the depth of field. And right now it's on off. So let's change it to camera settings. And now let's solo our object number 1 so it'd be easier to see what's happening here. And in the camera settings, I'm going to check the depth of field on. Now we're getting a little bit of a weird blur here, and that's because we're pretty far away from the object. Now if I take this blur level down, you can see how Plexus is integrating with our depth of field camera settings. Now let's undo this, and I'm going to get a bit closer to our object to get a better sense of what's going on. Now this looks nicer already, and I'm going to go into the Plexus settings, and under here in the blur factor we can play around a little bit more with the amount of blur we get. And in this project I found that 0.3 is working nice for me. Now Plexus gives us even more control over the quality. Down here in the Plexus settings, you see render quality times 1. Now I recommend you to leave it at 1, but it goes all the way up to 8. Let's have a quick look at the blur. Now it's 8. You see this is much smoother and realistic blur, and this is just really beautiful. But it can get really heavy on the computer. So I suggest that for a quick workflow and to be easy on your machine, use 1. But for now I'm going to use 4 because it's not too heavy, but still I'm getting nice blurs. Now instead of going one by one on all my Plexus layers and repeating the process, I can just Command C to copy this Plexus renders, select all of my Plexus layers in my composition, and Command V to paste my settings onto all of my layers. And there it is. Now I have the same settings for all of my Plexus layers. And that's it. Now when we look around our scene, we can see that we're really getting a nice depth of field effect. And this is a really powerful feature that we're having inside Plexus, and it makes everything looks much nicer. That's it for depth of field. Let's move on and make some camera moves. So I'll start with resetting the camera position. Now I know we worked hard on having our depth of field nice, but I'm going to disable it because I want my machine to work quick while I'm animating my camera. And I'm going to turn it back on when we're done. Now, other things we can do to make everything move quicker is get rid of the background for now. And I can put the resolution on quarter. And now things are moving much quicker and smoother. Let's frame object number 1 nicely. And this is where I'm going to add a keyframe. And the camera is going to have a little rest in the middle of my sequence before it'll move on. So in my camera, point of interest and position, let's add keyframes to both. Next, I'm going to go to the start of my composition and frame where I want to start from. Zooming in on this object. And going to the last frame and just zooming out really far. And remember, the depth of field is going to be affecting the objects quite drastically from so far away. Now we can go here and add some easy ease. Double click, have the influence on 100, just so we could have the camera stopping nicely in the middle. And so if I click the space bar, and now just wait for my preview to cache. And in the meantime, I can hide the color scheme, for we don't need this anymore. And there it is, our camera move in real time. Looking nice. Okay, that's pretty good. There's one thing that is bothering me is the position of this light. I just want to move it a little bit. Even push it a little bit to the back. And go to our lines and have a little bit more on that, so we could have the lines connecting. Okay, now if I get my Cybernet back and enable my depth of field, there's one more step that we could do, and this is kind of manually. I need to adjust my first frame again as well. Because I moved the light, I need to adjust my first frame here again. So it'll be something like that. And so putting the depth of field back, I want to manually tell the camera where to focus on at each point. So the best way to do it is to select the camera and the light where we're looking at, which is light number 4, and go to Layer, Camera, and set focus distance to Layer. That would tell the camera that this is what we're focusing on now. If I put it on better resolution, you can see now this is in focus. And I want to add keyframe to that. UU would show me the focus distance because we just adjusted it a little bit. And I'm gonna go to the second keyframes and do the same. Camera and object. It's now light number 1. Yeah, I got them both selected. Camera and point number 1. Go to Layer, Camera, set focus distance to Layer. Now going to our last frame, we don't really need to add a keyframe because it's going out of focus anyway. But if you want to manually get the blur more extreme, we can crank that up or down. Yeah, and now it's completely gone. So let's put something like 350, and that looks pretty good to me. Now the keyframe in the middle, I'm going to easy ease and do the same thing again. Set the influence to 100 on both sides. So now we have the camera looking and focusing on different objects at each part of our scene. Now one last thing I'd like to tweak here is our Cybernet layer. I just want extra blur on this one. So going to my depth of field and changing the blur factor to 1.2, and now I have a really nice blurred background Cybernet. That's it. I'm going to now render out the scene so we can see what we did, and I'm gonna come back to you when it's done. And this is it. This is what we made in this tutorial using Plexus. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful. My name is Yaya, and see you next time.